One of the significant issues we face today is the rapid decline of biodiversity in nature. We are in a biodiversity crisis, but we also know the solutions. We know how to bend the curve on biodiversity loss.
Business as usual has not priced in the negative effects of our business practices, and as a result, we're losing nature, we're losing biodiversity. If we can turn that narrative around, then we have every chance of redirecting capital to nature-positive solutions.
Biodiversity and nature are critical for human beings. If you think of just the food we eat and survive on, if you think of forests, they generate around about 75% of the fresh water that we need for living.
So much of our business, especially in our markets, is very intertwined or dependent on nature for survival. If we take some of our footprint markets where agriculture is a primary source of GDP, this is nature as it performs in an economic reality for a country.
30% of the climate mitigation that we need in place to achieve the Paris objectives can be delivered by nature. When we take something like mangroves, they represent not just an adaptation opportunity, but also a carbon and climate mitigation opportunity as well. These nature-based solutions are really, really important for local and indigenous communities. Very often they survive off this natural capital. Standard Chartered's market footprint is remarkable in the sense that it represents some of the most biodiverse rich countries in the entire world. And that's why it's a key theme for us to explore ways that we can really extract a value for protecting and conserving that natural capital into the future.
Innovation is critically important in sustainability to ensure that we're at the forefront of opportunity. It requires that innovative mindset, bringing something very different and novel to the table in pursuit of creating value and solutions.
It is really important that we adopt innovative approaches to how we think about how we value nature and biodiversity and how we can incorporate or integrate nature and biodiversity into financial products.
My greatest ambition for the work that we're doing here is to turn nature from a risk discussion to an opportunity discussion.
The challenge is so big, it is so vast. There is room for all of us to play a role. And critically, it is vital that all of us do play a role.